Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something that's often misunderstood and misrepresented. You know, when people think about rebellion, they think about people acting out.
Just making noise, causing trouble.
Yeah, but what we're talking about today is what we're calling rogue culture.
Right. We tend to focus on what's mainstream,
Right.
but the real action is often happening at the edges.
On the fringes.
Where people are looking at things differently.
Yeah, where they're questioning everything and kind of shaking things up.
Exactly.
We're going to be asking some really important questions about this idea of rogue culture.
Right.
And why it matters.
Yeah.
So the first question that I think we need to tackle is, what do we actually mean by culture? When we're talking about these rogue influences, what is that?
Yeah, because I think we have this fixed idea of what culture is.
Right.
You know, it's like it's
in a museum.
It's in a textbook. It's something that's already happened.
Yeah, it's static. It's not a living, breathing thing.
Right.
But it is.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's constantly changing.
Yeah, it's being redefined by the people who are actually living it, who are kind of pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, the ones who don't fit neatly in the boxes.
Right, but the ones who are the so-called rogue.
Exactly. And that's really what we're trying to get at with this rogue culture idea. It's about actually looking at the world and saying, you know what, I see things differently.
Yeah.
I want to do things differently, and I'm going to express that.
And that expression is what can be so powerful and so transformative.
Right.
And I think music offers a really great example of this.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, when we think about the history of music, there are so many examples of these rogue elements that come in and completely change the game. And one of the most obvious examples is jazz.
Yeah, jazz is a perfect example. It wasn't born in a conservatory.
Yeah, it wasn't born in some fancy music school or, it was born out of the real life experiences.
Right, out of the struggle, out of this survival.
Of people who were facing oppression.
People who were looking for a voice. And it was all about improvisation.
Yeah.
It was about taking what you had and making something new and beautiful.
Yeah, it was about bending the rules and sometimes even breaking them.
That's the fertile ground right there for innovation, for creativity.
Yeah, and so jazz, it wasn't just this one sound. It was constantly evolving, and it was even being disrupted from within.
Right, from within itself.
Yeah.
So you had these different waves.
And each of these movements kind of came in and challenged the previous generation.
Yeah, the previous establishment.
Yeah.
The ones who had once been the rebels.
Yeah, the ones who had once been the outsiders. So it's this really fascinating cycle.
Right.
You know?
The rebel becomes the establishment. That's what keeps culture alive.
So when you think about how musical genres have evolved, does this kind of resonate with you?
Yeah. It absolutely does. I think about all the different genres that I love and how they've changed over time.
Yeah.
And it's always this kind of back and forth between the establishment and the outsiders.
And it's not just limited to music.
Right.
You know, we can see this pattern in all sorts of different cultural expressions.
Yeah, in art, in fashion, in politics, you name it.
Let's take another example from music.
Okay.
Let's talk about punk rock.
Yeah, punk's a good one.
Yeah, so punk in the 1970s was more than just a musical style.
It was a whole attitude.
It was a reaction against what a lot of people saw as the excesses of mainstream culture.
Right.
The overproduction and the kind of lack of authenticity.
Yeah, it was a rejection of all that.
And it was raw, and it was
unpolished, unapologetic, in your face. And it was exciting.
It was exciting. And it wasn't just the music.
Right.
It was the fashion.
Yeah.
It was the visual art. It was the whole
identity. Yeah, and it resonated with so many people.
Yeah.
A feeling of alienation, maybe?
Yeah, a feeling of being misunderstood, a feeling of wanting something different.
Yeah, a desire for authenticity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so punk was this really important cultural force.
A cultural explosion. And it had a lasting impact. I mean, we still feel the ripples of punk today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great example of how this rogue energy can manifest itself in different ways.
And create something new and vibrant and exciting.
And meaningful.
Yeah. So if we kind of dig even deeper into history, we can see similar patterns playing out in different cultures and in different time periods.
Right.
So one example that I think is really fascinating is the significance of African drumming in the Caribbean. You know, this wasn't just
It wasn't just music.
Yeah, it wasn't just music for entertainment.
Right. It was so much more than that.
It was a form of communication. It was a way to connect with the ancestors.
With the spirits.
Yeah, with the spirits.
Better.
It was a way to express cultural identity, and it was even a form of resistance. And the colonial authorities recognized this.
They knew how powerful it was.
They knew how dangerous it was.
To their power structure. And so they actively tried to suppress it.
Yeah, they banned it. They punished people.
And it's interesting because that very act of suppression underscores the power of cultural expression.
Right.
You know, it shows how threatened the dominant culture feels by these rogue elements that are coming up from below.
The ones they can't control.
Such a powerful testament to the resilience of culture. You know, African drumming didn't disappear.
Right.
It went underground. It adapted.
It transformed.
And it eventually reemerged in new and vibrant forms like calypso, like reggae. It even played a role in the evolution of jazz.
Yeah, it was like a seed that was planted.
And then it sprouted up in all these different ways.
So it became this hidden language, this way for cultural memory and resistance. It's embedded within the rhythm itself.
Right.
And you've described it as survival music, rebellion music, and cultural memory set to rhythm, which I think is just such a...
It's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful and potent way to frame it.
Yeah.
You know, it really highlights the resilience of these rogue cultural forces.
Yeah, across time and space.
Yes, and I think it leads us really nicely to another example of someone who I think truly embodied this rogue power. And that's Bob Marley.
Bob Marley is a great example.
Yeah, so Bob Marley was more than just a musician.
Right.
He was a cultural icon.
Yeah, he was a global phenomenon. And his music wasn't just about entertainment.
Right.
It was about something much deeper.
It was about liberation.
About social justice.
It was about human dignity.
And it was about resistance.
Yeah, it was about standing up for what you believe.
His music resonated with people all over the world.
Yeah, it crossed borders, languages.
It crossed cultures, and it connected with people on a really deep level because it spoke to something universal.
Right.
You know, it spoke to our shared humanity.
To our shared struggles. To our shared hopes.
Yeah, and I think he's a really powerful example of how someone can take a localized sound and infuse it with universal themes and create something that truly transcends boundaries.
It speaks to everyone.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good segue into talking about Bolero. You know, when we think about music that goes against the grain or is really like challenging conventions. A lot of times we might think of something that's really loud or confrontational or, you know, maybe even angry.
Right.
But Bolero is such a different kind of rebellion.
Yeah.
It's like, I think the source even uses this phrase, it's like this quiet defiance, which I think is just so perfect.
What Revel did is fascinating. He took this single, really simple melody and he just repeated it over and over again.
Right.
And gradually over time, he added these layers of instrumentation. And it creates this almost hypnotic effect.
Yeah.
It just pulls you in through this sheer repetition and this really slow, deliberate build.
Yeah, it's almost like you're being lulled into this trance. Yeah. And you know, speaking of pulling you in, I was reading that like when Bolero was first performed, the critics were so confused.
Oh yeah, they didn't know what to make of it at all.
You were just like, what is this?
It was too simple.
Yeah.
Too repetitive, not serious enough for like the classical music world. I mean, it's kind of funny to think about it now, but at the time they didn't get it.
And so I guess it's like, is that simplicity alone, is that really what made it so rogue? Like, could something still be really simple, but also really conventional, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just the simplicity, but the way Revel used it. At the time, classical music was becoming more and more ornate, more and more complex. And Revel comes along with this piece that's almost stark in its simplicity.
Yeah.
And it's like he's deliberately stripping away all the excess, forcing the listener to really confront just like the essence of melody and rhythm in a totally new way. And it really kind of implicitly questioned, you know, this perceived need for these elaborate structures to create meaningful art.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because despite that initial confusion from the critics, Bolero went on to become one of the most recognizable and enduring pieces of 20th century music. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in movies. It's in commercials. I feel like everyone has heard it at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's one of those pieces that even if you don't know the name, you know the melody.
Exactly. And so I'm curious, thinking about your own experiences with music, can you think of a time when you heard a piece of music that maybe at first seemed really simple, but then ended up having this really profound effect on you?
Yeah, I think there are definitely a few pieces that come to mind. Sometimes the simplest things are the ones that really stick with you. But I think what's really interesting about Bolero in the context of rogue culture is what it teaches us about rebellion. Oh. It's not always about this dramatic confrontation, Sometimes it's about this persistent, unchanging force that just quietly asserts itself until the world around it shifts to accommodate it.
I love that.
Bolero held its ground.
Yeah.
It refused to be anything other than what it was, and eventually the world caught up.
Right. And I think that kind of brings us to this key takeaway for our listeners, which is that these rogue acts in music, whether they're, shouting from the rooftops or just whispering this single insistent melody like Bolero, they can have this really profound and long-lasting impact.
Absolutely. And it kind of makes me wonder, are there other examples like this in different areas of culture or society?
Yeah.
These forces that operated with this kind of quiet defiance.
Yeah.
What was it about their unwavering nature that led to their impact?
Right.
Some worth thinking about, I think.
Yeah, it definitely is. This has been such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it really has.
I've really enjoyed diving into this topic with you.
Likewise.
And I'm sure our listeners are going to have a lot to think about after this.
I hope so. And in our next deep dive, we're going to be looking at another really powerful example of this rogue energy.
Yeah.
And that's revolutions.
Revolutions.
Yeah.
Wow.
Specifically the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah.
And the incredible story of Harriet Tubman. And we're going to be exploring the rogue minds behind these movements, the people who dared to imagine a different world and who fought to make that world a reality. So definitely tune in for that.
You won't want to miss it.
Yeah, it's going to be a really fascinating and inspiring conversation.
Absolutely.
So until then, keep questioning.
Keep listening.
Keep challenging.
And keep it rogue.
And keep it rogue.
And be sure to register for the book launch at sample.roguesinparadise.com.